you could cover up anything with semantics and try to make yourself feel like an intelligent person. So you can come up and say, yes, you had a choice between life and death. I think one of the biggest myths about slavery, and that's only because I'm writing an album called The Middle Passage, and doing that you have to research a lot about slavery.
Yeah.
And one thing that I realized is that it was never a meek submission. And if you look up human beings, like you look up all these terrible things that have happened, the Holocaust, right? The My Lai massacre, the rape of the Bengali women, these horrible tragedies that have taken place. None of these things happen without people fighting back. Nobody ever meekly just submitted to rape and torture, right? I read, and it was interesting in these accounts, that all slave quarters after a certain year had to have a kitchen and a stove built inside. And I wondered, well, why? And then in the anecdote it said, well, because every single time that there was fire in the master's house, eventually the fire would keep spreading. And the master's house would mysteriously burn down. I understand that there's some confusion about people selling themselves into slavery and the idea that Africans sold themselves into slavery. Like, I understand what people are trying to do with that. They're trying to relieve themselves of the guilt and of the responsibility. But that is cowardice, intellectual cowardice, because what you're not discussing is how during the reign of these West African kingdoms in the 1500s, they were much lesser than they were in the 13th century and the 12th century during the reign of Mansa Musa. It was a decline after 300 years. So they were broken up into these much smaller kingdoms. And what's never spoken about is that the French and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch and everybody else decided they would collectively come together and as kings say, we need a constant influx of people. So what we're going to do is we'll support the kings that sell us rivals and people to then be sold into bondage. And the people that don't do that don't believe that's a sensible policy, we're going to replace that as a rule. And that was an actual practice that took place because they had the ability to influence things in Africa. And how would that be weird if only 200-300 years earlier, Africa had the ability to influence Europe in so many ways? And we're not even talking about the influence of Egypt on Greece. We're talking about the influence of West Africa on Central Europe and Southern Europe, specifically the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, the gold markets in Cairo, the reactivation of whatever civil society there was under the late Byzantine period in Greece. Sure, I studied ancient history, so it became necessary for me to look these up. But it's important to know nobody ever submitted meekly. So when you talk about it being a choice, I think every single person who was ever a slave made a choice to fight against it in some way, shape, or form. So we never submitted meekly to that. We never accepted our role in that. One of the things that really cements that for me is there's a CIA interrogation technique that was used in Guantanamo Bay. It was developed by a man called Martin Seligman. But Martin Seligman first tested this on dogs. He would torture them and electrocute them and teach them to only accept torture so that there would be no reminiscence of hope for the future. In other words, they had to teach them helplessness. And that's what you have to teach people. Because naturally we fight. You have to teach us helplessness. Because that wasn't part of the original human protocol. The original human protocol was fight back. Kill the people on the ships. Fight back. Kill the colonial masters. Fight back. That's it. That's who we are. That's who we always been. You know, we've always had these false narratives that existed. Mexicans are rapists. All right, that's so funny that you say that about Mexican people, that we're rapists, because actually indigenous people were raped until they became a quote-unquote Mexican, right? There were plenty of tribes and peoples that lived in that area. You took away their language, right? And then you gave them another language. You gave them Spanish for us to speak. But you talk about us being rapists. You came to this side of the world and you raped us until we were another people. How could you even open your mouth and talk like that? And in the tradition of the Middle Passage and in the tradition of like slavery, we realized that that was an interruption of our history. That's not our history. That interrupted our history. And we were carried through that by the songs that we sang. Our music helped us through that. Whether it was indigenous people being enslaved, African people being enslaved, whatever people had to deal with colonialism, white supremacy, genocide, one thing that I always remind people, my father told me this, and it's so important. The first things that the British did, or the French did, or any of those people did when they came to Haiti, or when they came to Peru, or they came to Pakistan, the Spanish, the Portuguese, whatever, whenever they went anywhere, one of the things they did was destroy the people's musical instruments. Now, some of these musical instruments have survived in the Middle East and Asia and Latin America. But think about this, brother. The vast majority of them were destroyed during the colonial period, which lasted about 400 or 500 years. How much music, how much rhythm, how much natural kind of feeling that we got was absolutely wiped out. Totally. A cultural genocide during that period of time. And we can't forget that. Because what does assimilation mean anyway? It means, oh, whoever you were isn't good enough. You need to be like me. Well, why would I want to be like you? What have you introduced to my society? The greatest lesson I learned in Afghanistan came from an old man. And he said to me, it's funny, everyone sees us as these great warriors, great fighters. No one can conquer us. And they weren't just fighting the Taliban with nothing. They fought the Russians with nothing. They killed 850,000 people was the estimate, just to kill 16,000 Russians. The sacrifice of the Afghan people is just incredible. They would block themselves, hold other soldiers, just so one person could get in with a rusty gun to shoot one officer. And it was because they wanted to be free. But he said, but there's a price for that. He said, we lost almost 1 million people in that war. They said, you know what we lost? We lost a whole generation of doctors. We lost a whole generation of filmmakers. We lost a whole generation of teachers. And he kept going on and on and on. So is that who we have to be? Either we become conquered or we die. Is that our only choice? If that's the choice, then I guess we all have a choice. Slavery or death. Huh? Not a hard choice to make.
Well, who's seen Infinity War?
Yeah, he about to jump off the roof. Yeah.